And the Kazem people were becoming the smartest people on the planet at this time. So, the fact that they're doing shamanism, so in other words, they're communicating with otherworldly beings, plus they're also becoming the smartest people on the planet, there's got to be some kind of relationship. And this is Mount Gerizim, that is the earliest and the true dwelling place of God, the God of the Israelites that will eventually be identified by Moses as Yahweh. All of the early patriarchs come to this mountain and have visions and build altars to their God. And it's said that this God manifests in a certain way on this mountain. And the term that's used is Shekinah. And now Shekinah basically means the presence of God.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits and everything in between. For episode 98, we are joined by Andrew Collins. Andrew Collins is a science and history writer who's been investigating the origins of human civilization since 1995. He is the co-discoverer of a massive cave complex beneath the Giza plateau, now known as Collins Cave. He's the author of several books, including Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, and he lives in Essex in England. Now in the show, Andrew discusses his new book, Origins of the Gods, co-written with his colleague Gregory Little. It's a remarkable study taking us from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to the Egyptian pyramids, from the stone circles of Europe to the mound complexes of the Americas. Andrew and Gregory show how again and again our ancestors built permanent sites of ceremonial activity where geomagnetic and gravitational anomalies have been recorded. In the show, Collins goes into how the earliest forms of animism and shamanism began at sites like the Novizia Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, and in particular, Qasim Cave in Israel more than 400,000 years ago. He explains how shamanic rituals and altered states of consciousness combine with the natural forces of the earth to create portals for contact with the otherworldly realms. In other words, the gods of our ancestors were the result of an interaction between human consciousness and trans-dimensional intelligence. Collins discusses the science of quantum entanglement and David Bohm's theory of implicate order, which support his own theories on what's happening with these portals and the ultra-terrestrial, possibly multi-dimensional intelligences that appear. It's a truly, truly fascinating hour and one I really enjoyed, and I'm very grateful to Andrew for taking the time to come on the Spirit Box. Now, if you'd like to support the show and get 2 years worth of plus and bonus shows, then join the Patreon. It's the price of a cup of coffee. Well, it is for now. Obviously, with inflation, that cup of coffee is going to go up exponentially, but the show will stay the same price. All right, let's get into it. Mr. Andrew Collins, you're very welcome to the Spirit Box.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners and viewers for listening to whatever I've got to say.
Brilliant. So to kick things off, you've got a new title out, Origins of the Gods. Could you tell the readers a little, or listeners rather, hopefully future readers, could you tell them a little bit about what the book is about, what the area of research you're exploring with the book?
Yeah, it always sounds bad to enter with, the book that you're pushing, but I'm afraid to say that as a writer, there's always one or more books at the back of everything. But the subject matter of the book is actually very, very important, particularly at the moment when you're getting these incredible US Navy videos released of so-called UAPs, unidentified phenomena, which we used to know as UFOs or flying saucers. And the fact that the US military, US government are accepting that UFOs today exist, and that they report that they are not secret aircraft that are being, tested by the US government themselves. Obviously, there's always the possibility that some foreign power could be creating them. This advanced technology, maybe they're drones or whatever. But beyond that is the possibility that we are dealing with vehicles or craft or whatever you want to call them that are not of terrestrial manufacture. And this is something that is the norm now. This is something that in the past would have been laughed at, in every level, from school to, to the workplace, to governments and whatever. Anybody that had an interest in this subject was generally poo-pooed and made to look pretty stupid. And you also realise that if you have got an interest in this subject, you have to keep your mouth shut. It's just you and a few of your nerdy mates that are actually into it. But things are changing now. You've only got to turn on the television at night, and some of these channels are just full of UFO documentaries, UFO series, some of which I'm involved with myself. So we're dealing with a subject that is being taken very seriously today. But then the question becomes, what are UFOs? Where do they come from? Are they alien? Do they pose a threat to us? And what's their purpose? Why are they here? The book itself answers these questions, but in a way which you wouldn't expect from the offset. And I'll tell you for why. Because I've investigated UFO cases, from lights in the sky to people having abductions for the last 40 years. And I concluded pretty quickly that there was something wrong in the idea that these craft were simply nuts and bolts spaceships coming down from some other planet or some other star system. They were doing too many weird things. There was too many irregularities in the way that they appeared and what they did. And that's not to mention the entities which people see in association with them. There were literally not just dozens, but hundreds of different types of all different shapes and sizes. Some looked human, some looked more animal, some looked, more like something out of folklore. And you just think, what the hell is going on? I mean, if we were being visited by aliens, and I'm not saying that we aren't, but if we were, then surely there would be, just a couple of different races involved. You'd become quite familiar with their vehicles, what they look like, their purpose for being here. There'd be some consistency, and that consistency wasn't there. And the other problem is that there were a large number of cases where people would observe a close proximity object, and it would respond to them. And what I mean by that is that it would either respond to the way that they were thinking by changing into maybe something that they felt they should be seeing, or it changed course based on them observing it and them thinking about it, or it seemed to take a personal interest in them immediately, almost like an inquisitive animal. And so it became obvious that you're dealing with objects that were sentient in nature. And this seemed weird because, other than if a helicopter is so low that you can wave to the pilot, or they've obviously got some kind of infrared FLIR camera system, they're not going to respond to you. Even if you're in your back garden waving to them, they're not going to respond to you. And so this interaction, this communion between us and the phenomena seemed to be unnatural and did not support the idea that we're dealing with nuts and bolts spacecraft. So, I had to start thinking out the box. I mean, I wrote about this in articles on various occasions, but there were no real answers. But then I investigated what was Britain's first real UFO abduction, and involved with a whole family of 5 driving along a road in Essex, the county that I live in. And they were on a short journey, 20 minutes. And sometime during that journey on a quiet country road, they see this oval blue light cross. They identify it as a UFO. One of the children is awake and he's quite excited by this. He's got his hands on the passenger and the driver's seat. The other two children are asleep. And then as they, turn a bend, the car headlights fail. The engine stops. They can no longer hear the tyres going over the road. And in front of them is this luminous bank of green mist. Completely engulfed the road before them. I mean, this was not a weather phenomenon. This was something incredibly unusual. And they go into this and everything just stops. They feel nauseous. They feel as if they've come to a halt. And other than, imagery that comes back to them through hypnosis and dreams and things like that, they're not aware of what happens next until they are 3/4 of a mile further on. Suddenly they sort of come to, and they get home and they realize that 3 hours are missing from their lives. I mean, 3 hours gone completely when they were on a very short journey. This is known as the Avery Abduction, by the way, for those that are, that want to look it up. And, I investigated and I took them to a hypnotist. I wrote up the whole thing for a two-part article in Flying Saucer Review, which was the leading magazine at the time on this subject. And that was it, really. I mean, as I say, at the time, I was quite happy to accept we were dealing with extraterrestrials. But over the years, I thought about this case and certain factors about it which didn't add up. And that's the fact that the gentleman involved, John Day, firstly, he said that at one point he could see the car below him and he was like looking down on himself and the people in the car, as if he was like astrally projecting. So you think, well, that's an odd thing. And it seemed as if this was happening whilst they were caught in some kind of light that, that was of intelligent nature. But the other important thing is that when the car came out of the abduction and it was on the road again, the children were in exactly the same places as they were when they went in. Two of the children were asleep in exactly the same positions, and the third one, who was awake, still had his arms on the passenger and the driver's seat standing up. And I thought to myself, this is a weird thing, because if this was aliens, would they put you back in exactly the same positions in the car and tuck the kids up and make them go to sleep somehow, just to try and hide the fact that this UFO abduction took place? And it just didn't seem to make any sense to me. And then finally, I think it was in 1991 or 1992, I was writing a book called The Circle Makers, which was mostly about crop circles and their connection with UFOs and lights and things. And it just suddenly came to me. I thought, what if they didn't spend 3 hours somewhere else, like in a physical place, but that they lost that time instantaneously? In other words, for what to us would be a split second. For them would be a split second. But in our world, it was 3 hours. They were just thrust outside of normal space time. In other words, whatever this luminous mist was, it was something that allowed them to enter into something that was beyond the 3 dimensions of space and the one temporal dimension in which we exist, in which the physical universe, the atomic universe, exists. And that got me thinking, just maybe we're not dealing with physical aliens here, but we're actually dealing with some kind of intelligence that exists outside of normal space-time, something that could be multidimensional in nature. And that was the key, really, for me, to start looking into UFOs from a different perspective. That in addition to the idea that we may be visited, from time to time, who knows, maybe more frequently, by physical aliens, that there was something else going on in the background, something that's being masked by our need to interpret the UFO phenomena as contact with extraterrestrials. And that is basically the sort of the impetus that I've had writing on various of my books, most obviously Light Quest, which came out in 2012, but this new book, Origins of the Gods, which is co-authored with my colleague Greg Little, that it tries to map out the idea that there are intelligences, beings that are transdimensional in nature, that coexist with us, and have done probably since the beginning of humanity, and that they've been nudging us in certain directions to do with innovations and technology, and that they may well have been behind various evolutions in human civilization right up until the present day, and that maybe they're still doing it now, and that these beings exist on not just the three dimensions of space and one dimension of time that we know and love, but they are multidimensional beings. And that if that is the case, then we're dealing with entities which are going to be very difficult to pin down scientifically, because we cannot see or really totally understand four-dimensional space reality. We can't do it. What I show in the book, and this is a borrowing from some of the other greats of the past, like Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist and an astronomer who we can mention separately for various matters. But he said that we cannot possibly understand the fourth dimension in the same way that a two-dimensional creature, a person, a so-called Flatlander, to borrow a term from a book in the past, would only see everything flat. So that if a three-dimensional object were to pass through their realm, let's say like a ball, for instance, as it passes through their two-dimensional realm, all they would see is a circle opening up larger and larger until it reaches the maximum diameter of that ball, and then as it continues its path through their realm, it would gradually close up until there was nothing left. So, in other words, all they would ever see of a three-dimensional ball would be a flat plan circle opening up and closing. So how would they interpret that? I mean, I'm sure there would be philosophers in their world that would say, just maybe this is part of a multidimensional form that we are only seeing part of. But it would only be speculation, because they could never properly identify what they were seeing. And it's the same with the three-dimensional reality in which we are three-dimensional creatures. So if a four-dimensional object were to enter into our three-dimensional space, we wouldn't see it properly. We'd see something. We'd be aware that there was something there, but unfortunately our minds would want to interpret it based upon our own understanding of reality and history and culture and contact with supernatural beings, preternatural beings, or whatever it was, whether they be good, like angels or God himself, whether they be bad, like demons, devils, or whatever. It would all have to be based upon our perception, based on our cultural and religious upbringing. And I mean, none of this is new in a way. I mean, Carl Jung was talking about the identification of UFOs in the 1950s. I mean, and he said that our interpretation of them and the way that we perceive them is based upon human archetypes that have existed for not just hundreds, but probably thousands of years. There have been very enlightened UFO researchers along the way who have also come to similar conclusions, like John Keel in the 1960s and 70s, most famous for writing the book, the Mothman Prophecies, obviously made it a blockbuster film. Jacques Vallée, who was a consultant for NASA. And of course, as I say, Carl Sagan himself. He understood the idea of multidimensionality, but he also accepted the idea that that humanity has probably been visited by extraterrestrials on countless occasions. He wrote a whole paper that was published in 1963 on this very subject, and he believed in aliens, and believed that we should investigate UFOs. But the problem is that when he became a consultant to NASA himself, they said to him, "You got to drop this stuff. If you want to get on with us, drop the concept of aliens, drop the concept of UFOs. It will make you and it will make us look really stupid. Drop the whole thing." And it's for that reason that various people today think that Carl Sagan was anti UFOs, or anti aliens, but he wasn't. He really, really wasn't.
Thank you. It's a great introduction to the to the area and the subject matter of your new title. I've got so many questions in my head that I'm trying to kind of focus them into an area. I'm just conscious of we've got a limited window of time, and I really want to get listeners to get the most from you on this occasion. You talked to shamanism quite a lot in this in the book. Can you unpack that for us in terms of how it connects to these potentially multidimensional beings or the ultra terrestrials?
Yeah, I mean, shamanism is, in essence, the communication with otherworldly realms and the beings that live within them. Now, whether people see these as fictional or actual is up to the individual. But it's something which begins at a place called the Kezem Cave in Israel as much as 400,000 years ago. And this is a site that I cover in great detail in the book. It's a brand new discovery. And the evidence of shamanism comes in the form of this wing bone of a swan, which has very clearly been modified in the sense that the feathers were removed. It's been cleaned up, and you can see the marks. And it's used specifically as paraphernalia to be linked to during what's known as shamanic flight. And this is where the shaman would, get into an altered state of consciousness, or a trance state, as it's also known. And they would make that journey, that shamanic journey, that flight. They would almost certainly, in this case, fly as a bird, fly as a swan, and enter into that world. And they would communicate with these intelligences, which they would probably perceive in terms of their ancestors, and also the animals, so the spirits of the animals that would be killed on the hunt, because there would be a special symbiosis between them and, let's say the deer or whatever it was that they would kill. I mean, they would use the bones that from those animals for special purposes. There would be a complete recycling process, not just based on, on the connection with the animal and its spirit, but also its bones, its flesh, everything. Nothing would be wasted. I mean, but the thing about the Kezem Cave is that these people were also using these stone balls, multifaceted stone balls, which the archaeologists there believe were also used as points of contact with otherworldly realms. Now, all this is really interesting, and I say this is the earliest evidence anywhere in the world of shamanism. Very new stuff. It was only revealed in 2019. But the greater significance about the Kezem people is that they were also undergoing great changes. They were inventing a number of firsts for humankind. For instance, they were creating the first canned food, for instance. This is where they would, after killing a deer, they would quickly chop off the leg and they would wrap it in a certain way so that it was canned, so that they could put it in their backpack, go off on their journeys and get it out at any time. And then chop away at the bone and get to the nutritious marrow inside it, which would be a meal for them. The earliest freeze-fried food, not in the way we understand it, but they had a way of curing meat and other products using the ash of a fire, which would mean that the food would last for again, many weeks, possibly even months. They had the first production of a certain type of tool known as a blade. They were producing, thousands of these things in the cave. They also had the first, what is described in the press as the School of Rock. where they had a whole teacher pupil thing going on in different parts of the cave, where pupils would learn how to do certain types of tools and whatever. They had a sustained fire pit, which was being used across tens of thousands of years. The first time that this was being used, and it also became a central focus of the cave. And many other little things like this, which might not seem like rock and roll to us, but for humanity, it meant that we were advancing in innovations and technology very quickly. And the Kazem people were becoming the smartest people on the planet at this time. So, the fact that they're doing shamanism, so in other words, they're communicating with otherworldly beings, plus they're also becoming the smartest people on the planet, there's got to be some kind of relationship. So, clearly that's what I would argue for. But on top of that, on the horizon, as seen from the Kazem cave, is a mountain of very special significance in the Bible. And this is Mount Gerizim, that is the earliest and the true dwelling place of God, the God of the Israelites that will eventually be identified by Moses as Yahweh. All of the early patriarchs come to this mountain and have visions and build altars to their God. And it's said that this God manifests in a certain way on this mountain. And the term that's used is Shekinah. And our Shekinah basically means the presence of God. But it very specifically relates to the manner that God manifests. And that is as light, or like some kind of blinding light. Very much like the way that Moses will much later encounter Yahweh on Mount Horeb, where he appears, within the burning bush, and also on Mount Sinai, where finally he will get the 10 Commandments and also be given instructions on how to make the Ark of the Covenant, which becomes like a mobile box that allows God to manifest immediately above it. Again, in its form as the Shekinah, this blinding light, basically. We've all seen these, pictures of the Ark of the Covenant, with this light above it. That's the Shekinah. It's also known as the glory of God as well. But it basically means, this shining light, basically. So, we know, therefore, that shining light was seen on Mount Gerizim. Well, I did a lot of research into this, and I found that historically and in modern times, Mount Gerizim is still noted for mysterious light phenomena. So I think very clearly this is what is being described in the Bible. In other words, God, they would say, look, God's there today because they could see these shining lights, these balls of light, or whatever it was that were appearing on the mountain. But that wasn't good enough for me. I needed to know whether there was more. And so I went first to the Kazem cave. I talked to the archaeologists there and learnt a lot. And that's all in the book. There are chapters on this and what the archaeologists say. But I also then went on into the West Bank to speak to the people that live on the top of Mount Gerizim. There's a community up there of people known as the Samaritans. It's nothing to do with the people you go to if you want help. These are people who claim to be the true descendants of the first Israelites. And they're still there today. They've still got their own Bible, they've still got their own traditions, which are even older than those of the Jewish faith. And I talked to one of the highest ranking priests there, and I said, look, these mysterious lights that, we're here in the past, I said, are they still seen today? And he said, yes, absolutely. And I said, well, how do you interpret them? And I was with an Palestinian interpreter, and, he just came back and said, Malak, which I knew, I didn't even need the interpreter to tell me that meant angels. And that's incredible. You've got this community on the top of this mountain that sees what we call today UFOs or UAPs, and they interpret them as the messengers of God, his angels, the angels, and that this is the sign of God's presence on that mountain. And what this does is to make Mount Gerizim what we refer to today as a portal location. And this is somewhere where mysterious lights, paranormal activity, and often cryptids, weird creatures out of time and space, will appear on a regular basis. And these portals are generally defined by the geology of a particular location. It's usually somewhere where tectonic plates come together and put a huge pressure on the subsurface underground geology. There will be fault lines, micro faults. There will be particular types of minerals, particularly quartz, tourmaline, things like this, that when put under pressure, create electricity. They create flows of electricity, flows of electrons that are released into the environment to create like these bursts of activity. And this in turn creates what's known as an ionospheric environment. And what this means is that it's ripe for the manifestation of something called plasma. Plasma is the full state of matter after solids, liquids, and gases. And it essentially is electrons that have been freed up from their atoms due to various processes, one of which is this pressure happening deep underground in a process known as piezoelectricity. And that these electrons will form their own electromagnetic fields around them. And they get very excited and they release tiny photons of light. Photons are, subatomic particles of light. And suddenly, boom, burst in front of you. You'll get almost like a switching on of a light bulb, and there'll be a light materialization in front of you. And these so-called plasmas, plasmoids, or plasma constructs can be quite solid. They can be big. They can be small. They can be any color. They can be groups of light. But the most important thing is that they can be sentient. They appear to have sentience and life within them. And this is something that's been noted again and again by people that have observed these lights. But more importantly, a number of studies have been done to do with plasma, suggesting not only that it appears to come alive, but that it may well be that it is a medium into which deeper consciousness or intelligences are able to manifest. And this was first really defined in the 1960s by a theoretical physicist by the name of David Bowen, who concluded and wrote that what he referred to as a proto-intelligence was able to inhabit plasma environments. And he said that it came up from something called the implicate order, something his colleague Basil highly referred to as the pre-space. And this is like a non-local medium, something that's outside of normal space and time, something that is not constrained by the normal laws of physics in which we live. But the other important thing is that recent studies of plasma have suggested that it may actually harbour an extra dimension of space. There's quite a lot of evidence for this. I go into this in huge detail in my part of the book. And therefore, it could be multidimensional in nature. And if that's the case, it may well be that plasma, which, by the way, is the light of the sun, it's the light of black holes, neutrons, stars, lightning, even your telly glows because of plasma. Plasma is something which is, so integrally important to the universe. I mean, some estimates have even suggest that as much as 99% of the universe could be made up of plasma. So, it's natural that we should consider the possibility that life exists in a plasma state, basically. And if that's the case, that it could be multidimensional. So, in other words, many UFOs could be manifestations of plasma. And in fact, a number of studies that have been done into the UFO phenomena by governments, the British government, American government, a big study in Norway, a place called Flatlander, basically concluded that the main constituent of most UFOs is plasma. So, going back to our folks at the Kesem Cave and Mount Gerizim, is it possible that these lights, which are not only seen today, but which have been seen historically and may well have convinced the ancient Israelites that Yahweh, inhabited Mount Gerizim? Is it possible that the Kesem people were also aware of these lights, were these objects, these plasmas, and that they interacted with them and then enhanced that interaction with the intelligences through altered states of shamanism and the invention of shamanism? And through this, they gained innovation and technology. And that this is the beginning, if you like, of the whole concept of ancient aliens, or was God an astronaut?
That's fascinating. And it's really, the fact that he said Malak is really intriguing. Obviously, with the association of angels being made of light, but kind of pulling that thread from an Islamic perspective, when we think of kind of Allah's three sapient creations of angel, jinn, and human being, and jinn being made of smokeless fire, could be analogous to plasma, as well as being a type of intelligence interacting with people, which is in that region as broadly as well. I one of the things that I was really interested in, jumped out at me from your book, was in chapter 9 with the Native American people talking about their a couple of accounts of Native American people meeting these beings. And one detail I noted was, on several occasions, it was individuals who had just experienced the loss of someone they loved. They had a trauma, and then went on to have an encounter. And it was, what jumped out at me is it's really analogous to the accounts of the Scottish witch trials, where somebody who had confessed to being a witch and talked about having a familiar who appeared to them. Quite frequently in the accounts, they talked about having a sick child who was going to die, or their partner had just died, and in that kind of subsistence farming in the periphery of Scotland, or just being incredibly poor in the 1600s, would have meant death, and equally a traumatic event, and then these familiars would appear. It's just something that kind of jumped out at me, and I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, obviously a lot there, actually. I mean, firstly, obviously the Native American side of it, that's handled by Greg in the book. I mean, he's one of the top experts in America on Native American mound building cultures and, the tribal peoples associated with them. But he's also written books on, UFO phenomena, paranormal phenomena as well. So he's been able to study, the different First Peoples from that perspective, and he's got quite a unique, view of it, simply because he's asked the right questions of them. I mean, his own background has got a very slight trace of Native American himself, but his big conclusion relating to Native Americans is that at the core of all of their beliefs and the purpose that they did really complex rituals was to maintain this connection, not just with the universe, but with these intelligences that they saw as governing cyclic time and governing the evolution of their tribe. And that if they did not do these rituals, like the so-called Maxim ritual that he describes in detail, which lasts for many, many days, and there are different forms of this undertaken by all, well, I would say probably all the different tribes, is that this contact between them and these intelligences would cease, and that when that contact ceased, they would no longer be evolving, that there would be entropy, in the sense that they would start devolving and everything would fall apart. So that it was essential for them to to retain communication with what they saw as these, star beings, quite literally. Now, whether these beings, did genuinely come from other stars or whether they were coming from, parallel realms or whatever, I mean, that's a matter of debate. Of course it is. And I think that certainly some tribes do believe in what we call extraterrestrials, but others also very clearly believe in, transdimensional beings that connect with us and that can be communicated with through things like caves or sacred places or portal locations of the sort that I would describe somewhere like Mount Gerizim. I mean, if we look at, let's say, North America, a similar location to Mount Gerizim would be somewhere like Mount Shasta, for instance, where a large amount of lights are seen. Weird light beings are seen. People have transformative experiences that change their life, start religions and whatever. Plus cryptids and other paranormal activity goes on in the area. Or the Blanca Peak in the San Luis Valley of Colorado, which is what I'll be going to later on this year again, which also has produced huge amounts of UFO sightings across the years and other types of weird activity, and was very sacred to not just the Navajo people who were indigenous to the area, but several other tribes as well would come to that area, put away their differences, just for the time that they were there, and see this as like some kind of sacred land that they were able to each perform their rituals. And probably this brings us on to somewhere else that features quite heavily in the book, and that's Skinwalker Ranch. Now, Skinwalker Ranch has become the showcase portal location in the world. I mean, it's got its own TV show. And during the construction of this book, I was privileged to be able to spend some time at Skinwalker Ranch, talking with, not just the guys, that you see in the TV show, but also chatting with people that live there and were working there. I mean, and had no real interest in UFOs. And not only did these people have many of their own UFO sightings to relate, but the right type of geology is found there. Fault lines, sandstone containing high quantities of quartz that would powder and become like a sort of desert sand floor that was so so powder like that it goes in your throat. You have to wear scarves there, and all of this is exactly the ripe environment to create electron bursts and plasma manifestations. And if plasma itself has a multidimensional state, then it becomes almost like a doorway or a portal itself to allow other intelligences, other energies, whatever it is, to enter into our space-time on a temporary basis. And I think this is one of the reasons why there is so much activity there, and why Native American peoples in the past saw the area of Skinwalker Ranch as a sacred land, a place that they could communicate with these otherworldly intelligences. And that, this is what it was almost like a no man's land between their tribal territories where they could come. There's a stone circle there, there's rock art, and there's obvious evidence that they saw this area as very, very important. And so, this is just another example of these portal locations producing UFO and paranormal phenomena today. But in the past, they were very important to indigenous peoples. And obviously, I mean, I live in Britain, and places that produce UFO phenomena on a regular basis not only have the right geology, but also often have folklore that involves, tales of goblins, of elves, of fairies carrying lights, abducting people and stuff like this. These are the stories that you find at locations that are today hotspots of UFOs. I've written about this in a number of books, and of course, we talk about this again in new book Origins of the Gods.
It's absolutely fascinating. The kind of fairies and jinn are they're kind of a real kind of core subject matter for this show. We talk about it a lot, and one of the things that comes up frequently is actually the frequency of karst landscapes in fairy hotspots, like in area the karst area of the former Yugoslavia, and then in kind of the Burren, the west of Ireland. Yeah, there definitely seems to be some kind of correlation with
Well, absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, it's not just quartz, or granitic rocks that produce electricity,
Mhm.
but chalk, limestone,
Mm.
um, rocks that where aquifers and water can flow through easily
Yeah,
or be retained quite easily, um, become very strong places of production of electrical currents. And, you know, I mean, in essence, electrical currents are the flow of electrons that have been freed up and are going from higher to lower potentials. And, I mean, this is not something that's like some kind of new age speculation. I mean, there's
no,
whole
not
books
remotely.
written on
Yeah,
this subject,
yeah.
which I've used as
Mm.
references in this current book. And if that's the case, and there are certain hotspots, if you like, on the landscape where this is happening more frequently, then it becomes these places where this type of phenomena takes place, particularly where these electrons can flow into the local environment, like caves, for instance,
Mm.
like wells, um, where which are linked quite obviously to fissures and aquifers and sources underground. They become the points of connection
Mm.
between this electrical activity underground and what's happening, overground itself. And I think it's important to point out that the electromagnetic fields of electron flows is enough to affect human consciousness. It can induce experiences, it can induce otherworldly sensations that are enough to allow us to perceive these coexisting invisible realms around us. Now, once again, whether you perceive those as real or imaginary or simply something that the brain needs as a sort of mindscape
Mm-hmm.
to connect with these intelligences is up to the individual. I mean, I happen to believe that they are real, and that the archetypes that are created uh, at different places can be utilized by higher intelligences to convey information to us. In other words, if you've got a site that is, let's say, haunted by a white lady, that white lady, I think, is the product of human consciousness interaction with that site over a very long period of time, perhaps thousands of years. But it's although it's a genius loci, the sort of spirit of the place,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that under certain circumstances, it can be taken over using processes of quantum entanglement to convey information to us. In other words, if we go to a certain site and we find ourselves in communication with, let's say, that white lady, we might not be speaking to somebody who lived a few hundred years ago who happened to drown there. We are actually in communication with an intelligence that's beyond that. It's simply using that archetype to convey thoughts and ideas to us, like the Kesem cave. They almost certainly wouldn't have seen, the intelligences associated with the lights as extraterrestrials or transdimensional beings. Of course
Mm-hmm.
not. They would have seen them as manifestations of their ancestors and as the spirits of the animals killed in the hunt. And even though they may have thought that they were communicating with these sources, it may well be that these transdimensional, beings were utilizing these archetypes for their own purposes. And
Right.
that's why shamanism is so important, because it allows that possibility of communication with these higher intelligences that have coexisted with us since the beginning and may well have been there since we were in Africa, as much as 2 million years ago. I mean, what I show is that this communication almost certainly began once we invented fire, because once we were able to to repeat the creation of fire, using striker lights or whatever it was, or carrying around a lighted piece of wood that was struck by lightning, whatever it was that allowed us to make the first fires and to sustain them, meant that we would have to throw on plants to keep them going, and quite clearly at some point some of those plants would have been psychoactive in nature. And so people would have gone into a shifted state of consciousness. Now, clearly, to start off with, they wouldn't have known what was going on, but eventually it could have taken hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, that they would have realized that certain plants were having an effect upon them, and it was allowing otherworldly contact to take place. So they would have enhanced it by seeking out specific plants and using them. And this seems to coincide perfectly with the change of use of stone tools from what we call pebble tools, which were simply, pick up a pebble that's come out of a river and smash it on the ground so that it's pointed in some way, and then use it as a tool, to the creation of the first hand axe, what in archaeology is referred to as an Acheulean hand axe. And these are beautiful, multifaceted objects, the objects of beauty, objects of art, which were like the sort of Swiss army knife of their day. And the earliest one of these was about 1.75 million years ago, and it was found at a site west of Lake Takama in what is today Kenya. And this coincides pretty well with the first sustained use of fire. So, is it possible that the design for the Acheulean hand axe came through altered states of consciousness and seeing geometric forms and communicating with what they perceived as otherworldly beings? In other words, the construction of that hand axe, which, by the way, would go on to be used right the way down to around 200,000 years ago, I mean, almost unchanged, was that the product of the earliest connection, communication with these transdimensional beings? I think there is a strong possibility that the answer is yes.
Right. It's a remarkable proposition, and we're dealing with such vast lengths of time that it's almost hard to compute, the vast expanse of time. And I suppose thinking about time and thinking about how intelligence might be communicating with us in this way, and then kind of as you hypothesize that it may be appearing to us in ways that are relative to us in the space and time, and kind of our understanding of the world at that moment, the white lady, the ancestor, I mean the therianthropic figure. Do you think that I have to think about how I'm going to phrase the question, but do you think, is it a case of like that relationship that we have with whatever this intelligence is, that they are existing outside of time?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for us, time goes forward. We can't really perceive it in any other way, although there is a certain amount of scientific evidence to suggest that, we can affect the future and the future can affect us. But the best way of perceiving time outside of the three dimensions of space and one of time that we deal with is quantum entanglement. Because, I mean, this is the idea that particles can become linked or twinned, and that no matter how far away they get from each other, they still retain an instantaneous link. So if you tweak one, the other one will tweak in equal and opposite direction. But of course, we're not just dealing with one particle here. We're dealing with multiple systems of entangled particles that, until recently, were considered to only have an effect in the microcosmic world, in the subatomic level. But within the past 5 years, various experiments have been done that have proved that entanglement affects the macrocosmic world, in other words, the world in which we live. Now, not only can this now provide possible answers for things like telepathy, mind over matter, and possibly even precognition, but the fact is that there is no real time on a quantum level, particularly if you're dealing with non-local mediums, through which this information or energy transfer must take place if it's instantaneous. So there is no reason why one entangled particle could go into the future whilst another one could go into the past. And if that's the case, then you can create entangled systems of particles where, one is in the future and one of the parts of it, the other part of it is in the past. And I mentioned precognitions there, and this is a very good example because, if telepathy can be explained using quantum entanglement, then it could explain why we have premonitions. I mean, I'll give you a good example. My ex-wife was in a vehicle and she was just in a car going along, and she started to sort of drift and saw this road accident in front of her. I mean, she saw it in great detail. Car come over Central Reservation, all the cars split to try and avoid this and whatever. And she sort of just woke up out of this daydream and thinking it was happening, and of course it wasn't. But 5 minutes further down the same motorway, this is exactly what happened, identical, and yet she told the person she was with in the car. So they were able to say, "Oh my God, 5 minutes ago you saw this." Now this is perfect example of a premonition, because it's almost like your future self is sending back this information to your present self, to almost like a warning. There is a danger ahead, directly ahead, on the road ahead. And it could well be that this is something that was installed into us, millions of years ago when we were, let's say, in a jungle or a forest environment and a dangerous animal was, about to attack us. And it could mean life or death. And that information could be then sent back to yourself 5 minutes earlier so that you take a different path, like a sign, an omen, right, of what is to come. And the explanation of that is quantum entanglement. And if that's correct, then what it means is that the past, the present, and the future all have an interrelationship, that they're all still being played out in the here and now. I mean, in other words, if somebody does something in the 16th century, let's say they murder somebody, then that's still being played out forever and will do forever, probably until the end of the universe. Mm-hmm. And that if somebody goes to the location where that murder takes place, there is a possibility that they could see that murder taking place. Right. And of course, what would we call that? Seeing a ghost, mm-hmm. A haunting. Yeah. Because in my opinion, I don't think hauntings are simply, the replay of some tape of the past. I mean, in some ways you could interpret it that way, but I think you are really seeing what's happening in that instance in the 16th century of murder taking place. So, in other words, so if you then take this on to what I've written about in the book to do with these objects being plasma containing these multidimensional intelligences that exist outside of normal space-time, then a lot of people, when they see them, that they feel like this incredible connection with them. They feel as if they know the intelligence involved, as if that intelligence has always been there for them, that since they were a child. And they then spend, the next part of their life, possibly even until they die, trying to sustain that link, that contact with it. They want to keep going out to the spot, see if it'll come back, or they want to go to another site where UFOs are seen. That it's this contact, and I think that this is borne out the fact that these intelligences, if they exist outside of normal space-time, when you make contact with them on a certain day, they have every opportunity of going back to when you were a child in a cot, as a baby, and making a link with you at the same time, as well as going all the way forward to the point that you die and saying, hi, we're still here. And they're doing it all at the same time, the same moment.
Mm-hmm.
To us, there are many years in between. But if they exist outside of normal space-time, they have that opportunity. They have this omnipotent or omnipresent quality to them, which brings us on to, why are they here? What are they doing? And I think that we have to see it that they are super intelligences. They are so far beyond our own understanding of life that, again, we are just clutching at straws to try and understand why they were here. And it is even possible that they see us in the same capacity that we might see an ant nest, the movements of ants. But the thing is that I think what's important for the future is that we not only recognize their existence and how to communicate with them, but we show them that we are ready to move on to the next stage, that we are not just aware of them, can communicate with them, but we want them to take our hand onto the next stage of evolution, whatever that be. And to do that, I think we've got to show them that we have great intelligence ourselves. It's like I talked about ants there. We look at ants, we might prod them, some people will kill them. Some people make studies of them and publish papers on them, but that's it. Ants are always going to be ants, unless one day they all gather together, climb up your wall and write out your name. And if that ever happened, you'd have to take notice of them. You'd have to respect them and treat them very, very differently. So we have to do the same in terms of these transdimensional intelligences that I believe are behind UFOs. And when I say UFOs, I don't mean all. I do believe that there is absolute room that we could be dealing with, physical aliens and, alien hardware coming here. There's far too much evidence of that. But I think what's important is not to confuse the two things together, or just to assume that everything is nuts and bolts spacecraft and flesh and blood aliens, because that, I think, will prevent us knowing more about these true intelligences that seem to be behind the manifestation of many plasma or light-based UFOs.
Absolutely fascinating. And there's so much there. I really, really enjoyed the hour, and I'm conscious of time, and in terms of your availability, I know is condensed at the minute. So for anybody who wants to find out more about your new title and indeed your back catalogue work, where's the best place for them to follow you or pick up a copy of the book?
Yeah, my website is andrewcollins.com. You can email me via that. But in addition to that, obviously, I'm also on all social media. The links are there on the opening page of the website if you want to follow me in any capacity. And of course, the book is Origins of the Gods, Kezem Cave, Skinwalkers, and Contact with Transdimensional Intelligences by myself, Andrew Collins, and my colleague, Greg Little, available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other online bookstores, basically. So that's it. If you want to come with us to places like Turkey, we do tours to a place like Göbekli Tepe and the ancient cultures there. And we're also going to Egypt next year. But all those details will be available on social media and on our websites in due course.
Deadly. Well, Andrew, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you so much for your time. And I hope you've made a full recovery from COVID. I know there's a rough dose going around, so I hope you're feeling better.
Yeah, I'm fine now. Yeah, thank you very much.
No worries. No worries. there you have it. Ultra-terrestrial beings coming through portals, delivering knowledge and developing human innovation and technology, and who's not to say possibly our intelligence and ability to ideate. I hope you all enjoyed that. I certainly did. I always find Andrew's work fascinating and hugely informative and well researched. So I hope you guys will check out his work, check out the links below, and go for it. Right, that's it from me. I'm Darren Mason, and you'll be listening to The Spirit Box. Take care. Talk soon. Bye.